Okay, well, thanks all for coming. We're all here to talk about GitHub Actions for Perl development. I don't normally do this at the start of my talks, but as I mentioned in the lightning talks, I haven't been over this side of the Atlantic for 20 years or so I thought it might be worth just telling people who I am. So I'm Dave Cross, known as Davorg on most social media sites. I've been programming in Perl since 1990. Oh, that's a long time. I started London PM. Sorry about that. That was 25 years ago. I've got a white camel. Mohammed's here. He's got his white camel now. Hello. I do training courses. I've written Perl books. I blog about Perl at perlhacks.com. And more recently, I've started to publish Perl ebooks through perlschool.com. So you might have read some of my books, read my blog posts, used things like Planet Perl or CPAN Dashboard, which I was speaking about a couple of days ago, or maybe bought a Perl School book. So that's kind of an overview of who I am. But we're actually here to talk about, not about me, talk about GitHub Actions for Perl development. And what we're going to do is we're going to give a very quick introduction to continuous integration and continuous deployment, then an introduction to GitHub Actions and an overview of what it is, how it works, look at some prior art, and then dig a little bit more in detail into actions for CI, actions for CD, and that's it. Right, so who here uses continuous integration and continuous deployment? So, yeah, half of you or so. So some of you know what I'm talking about here. So what we're talking about is making it as easy as possible to integrate new work into your main branch as often as possible. And the way that we do that is by setting up automated checks so that your new code meets various project standards. We're talking that the test passed, that the test coverage remains high enough, documentation coverage, linting perhaps, which in the Perl world of course means Perl critic. You might build release artifacts like an RPM or something like that you are then using to push your code through the deployment process. But the important thing about it is that it happens automatically. It happens repeatably. Is that the right word? And it happens on every commit or every pull request into the main branch. The next step on from that is continuous deployment. Is when you automatically release your code into your production environment. Might not be your production environment. Might be releasing it into your QA environment, a UAT environment. But again, the important thing is it happens automatically. Long gone are the days when I've worked on projects where the release process was bringing up a wiki page and following a list of steps and cutting and pasting commands into a terminal window. And it happens repeatably. So you know that when you do a release, you know it's gone through all the correct steps to get that release out there into production. Something else to bear in mind that's kind of tangential to this, I guess, is that there's a difference between a deployment, which is taking your latest code and putting it onto your production servers, and a release, which is making that new code live on your production servers. Again, I've worked on projects where doing that, a new release needs to go live at midnight, and that's done by a programmer being up at 11:30 at night running through all the commands to get it live at exactly the right time. Whereas these days we would probably use a feature flag, so we can deploy the code during the day, and you just need someone to be up and to flip that switch at the right time. So you'll all be aware, no doubt, of various CI and CD tools: Jenkins, Travis CI, Circle CI, Appveyor, and GitHub Actions is one of the newer ones around. Okay, so what do I mean by GitHub Actions? So what it is, it's a way to run code or take actions in response to events that happen to your repo. Events like a commit or a pull request or an issue being raised. You can do time-based events, so basically a cron job. You can even have a manual run, so you've got a button on the actions page on your repo and you just press it and the action runs. And something I've been investigating recently is you can actually run it as a webhook. So you make an HTTP request which fires one of your actions. They run on Docker containers. GitHub supply containers that are Linux, Windows, or Mac OS, but you can actually just run it on any other container that gets pulled down from the Docker hub or any other Docker place. We define them in a YAML file, which lives in a special directory inside your repo, inside .github/workflows. You can put YAML files there of any name, and obviously you can have more than one action associated with all of your with each of your repos. So I said it's defined in a YAML file. This is the top half of the YAML file would look something like this. We give our action, our workflow, a name. And then one of the most important parts of the YAML file is this key on, which tells us when this action is going to trigger. So there's some examples here. This one says whenever something is pushed to the repo, then we'll run this. This is what a scheduled action would look like, and it just uses exactly the same syntax as a cron job. And workflow dispatch is the one I mentioned that puts a button on the web page, so you can just press it to run the action manually whenever you want. So most workflow files will have a name, and they might not have all of these on options. And then the bottom half of the YAML file is where all the work happens, where we define a set of jobs. Each job has an ID. Runs on is where you define which of the containers it works on. So this is just using the standard GitHub Ubuntu build, and then the job has a series of steps. Each step has a name, although we'll see later on that's optional because I've forgotten to put it on all of mine. And then basically a step consists of one of two things. There's this thing called the Actions Marketplace where people can, well, it's like CPAN for GitHub Actions, and people can put out actions that you can reuse, and you reuse them with the uses keyword. And what you've got here is the checkout action, which you'll see in pretty much every workflow you ever work on, because it's the one that checks out the repo onto the container that the action is running on. Or the other thing that you can do is just run a piece of code. And what we're doing here is we're running a program that actually exists within the repo. So we checked out the repo and then we run a program. So that's a very high level look at what GitHub Actions look like. We'll see more examples in a while, but let's just have a look at some prior art. So what already exists out there? Are there Perl actions available in the GitHub Actions marketplace? Are there other people that have written stuff that we can use? Because, you know, open source, it's all about stealing other people's code. Sorry, using ideas from other people's code. Sadly, if you go to the GitHub marketplace and search for actions to do with Perl, there are 10, which is a slightly small number because there are thousands of actions available. And if you were to search for JavaScript or Python, then you'd get far more back. So let's have a look at other other developers. Many people have done work in this area, but Gabor and Brian Foy have got some. They've actually got a repo where they've gathered together good examples of actions that they've been using. So we can have a look at that and borrow some code from there. Okay, moving on to actions for CI. The first thing we want to do is build an action for testing, an action for looking at coverage, an action for linting, which, as I said, means Perl critic. So this is the top half of an action for testing. The interesting thing to see here that we're doing that's quite clever is this strategy key, which tells GitHub Actions to run our code basically in a kind of loop. And what we've defined here is a matrix where we've got 3 different operating systems that we want to run this test on. And paging down the file, we've got, I think, 9 different versions of Perl, and obviously I haven't updated it to add the latest version of Perl yet. And then we get to the actual definition of the job. And the interesting things to pull out here are the name actually has variables in it, so it tells you that it's running on a particular version of Perl on a particular operating system. It then changes the name of the container that it's running on, depending on where it is in the matrix looping. And then the actual work that each of those iterations does, we're using this is one of those 10 Perl actions in the marketplace. It's one called setup Perl, and it basically installs a particular version of Perl onto your container, and you pass it the Perl version, as you can see there. Another interesting thing we can see here is if things fail, there's this failure flag, and what we're doing here is we are taking the build log. If the installation of the CPAN modules goes wrong, then CPAN very helpfully writes a file, a log file, so you can look at it, but it's on a container that's about to be destroyed. So what we do, GitHub Actions has this concept called artifacts, where it will bundle up stuff into a zipped file or a tarball and store it somewhere outside the container, so you can then access it and work out why your CPAN modules didn't install cleanly. So moving on to coverage, this is a bit simpler actually. You can see I'm actually using a specific container here. I've built a container which has got all of the coverage modules that I need in it. And then the actual coverage step. Actually, this is probably a little bit more complicated than it needs to, because I'm reporting my coverage to coveralls.io, but you don't need to do that. So maybe I'll simplify that at some point. And here's an action for Perl critic. Again, it's running on a container that I've written specifically. And one other slight complication here, I'm running Perl critic, but if you've, well, obviously you've run Perl critic against some of your code, and if Perl critic finds anything it objects to in your code, it thinks that is a failure, so it returns a failure. And that kind of screws with GitHub Actions, because it thinks the action has gone wrong, even though finding the problems is exactly what you're trying to do. So I've just put this continue on error flag to true, so it doesn't die when you get a failure. So we've got these 3 actions that I've written, and we've all got many repos, and we want to use the same or similar actions in all of them. Copying is always a bad idea. software should be reusable in some way, and actions obviously are. So you would have seen, if you were paying attention, on the slides that showed those three workflow files, they've got on workflow call, and this is a special on flag which says you can call this from other actions. And you have this uses keyword that tells you to use a separate actions file. So I'm going to, over the next few slides, going to go into an example from Array Compare, one of my CPAN modules. Now, the on is fairly simple here, but if you see the three jobs, we've got a job for build, a job for coverage, and a job for Perl critic, and all they do is load the actions from my other repo. So every time I fix those actions to improve them, I immediately get the benefit across all of the repos that use them. Yeah, I don't know how well you can see this actually, but this is what it looks like on the actions page. So it's a bit blurred, so maybe I'll go quite quickly. But down the left-hand side there, you'll see there are actually 27 jobs under the build job, and that's the matrix doing its thing. That's 9 Perl versions across 3 operating systems give you 27 jobs. And if you clicked on one of them, you would see the test output there on the test coverage job at the bottom. Again, you can't really see it, but the slides will be online later. You've got the coverage output from test cover at the bottom there. And for the CI one, you've got the output from, not the CI one, from the Perl critic one, you've got the output from Perl critic. Some of the things that I want to do on these more managements, maybe put some output of the cyclometric complexity, maybe look at quality scores. I want to do prettier output. I'm thinking using GitHub Pages, I can put that information into a database and produce a GitHub Pages website showing you what those numbers are, rather than having to go down into the, rather than going down into the actual report pages. So I'm working on a project called Perl Diver, which will build CI pages for your, hope to be able to talk about that a bit more later in the year. And then there's CD, continuous, I'm running a little bit late, continuous deployment. Now that is less specific to Perl because you're doing the same things as anybody is. You're releasing to AWS, you're building a Docker container, you're building a RPM or a Debian file. So these are all well understood, and there are standard actions that already exist for these. But there's one Perl-specific deployment that I wanted to talk about briefly, which is releasing a module to CPAN, and this is what I'm working on at the moment. So I'm installing CPAN M, and then I'm installing all of the modules that my repo needs. And notice that when I'm using CPAN M to install deps, because it's me doing the release, I'm installing all of the recommends, suggests, and all of the, basically every module that this could possibly use. And then we need to build the hash. Sorry, we need to build the tarball. And there's 2 ways of doing that, depending whether you've got a build.pl or a makefile.pl. And then, again, this is me thinking aloud because I haven't written this yet. There's a module called CPAN uploader, so I could install that and call it. And now that's going to need a username and password, and GitHub has this thing called secrets, where you can store encrypted data against your repo or against your organization. So you can put your CPAN user and your CPAN password in there The other thing you'll see on GitHub repo pages is that they can do releases a tarball to download actually from GitHub rather than going to CPAN. So you'll see a lot of languages people are releasing code through GitHub rather than npm or something like that. So we can do that. We can use an existing action from the marketplace to build a tarball, turn that into an artifact, and then upload it. And we also want to be able to release, we need to know how we're going to trigger that release. Now, we could do it manually with a button, but we can also do it automatically, I think, and again, this is something that I'm working on. And we can filter the pushes on a tag and a branch and say, if you push something to the main branch and it's got a tag that's the release, then run through the release procedure. So that's how I think I'm going to be doing that. These actions are all available now. They're in my repo there, so dav.org/GitHub workflows. Things are moving pretty quickly, so they're quite under-documented at the moment, I'm afraid. Patches are welcome. Please let me know if they are useful to you. Also, please let me know if you try them and you have some kind of problem with them. I'm keen to get them working. Now, slight plug. I've written a book about GitHub Actions. It's called GitHub Actions Essentials. You can find out all about it on my website there. Now, I should point out it's not specific to Perl. It's about general use of GitHub Actions, but it's covers a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. Also, if you listen to Software Engineering Radio, the podcast, episode 567, it's me having a conversation with one of their guys about how useful GitHub Actions is. And also, is there any way that maybe I can help you implement some of this stuff on your projects? I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I've actually gone over time by 5 minutes, so I don't know that I've got time for questions, but if you have any questions, feel free to stop me in the... One or two questions I'm getting? Yeah, okay. No, that you, yes.
Yeah, so I just noticed, as far as the marketplace for Perl,
yeah, so to repeat the question, there are actions for installing stuff with CPM and CPAN-M. Sometimes I think, I'm not sure what the point of using an action is for something that's so simple that's one line of code. But yes, that's certainly something that I would look at. Sure. Well, I think we better stop it now because I think they're going to want us to start taking this wall down. Sure. Thank you.